Australia's special session with Dr. Jim Fadiman. And we have Jim here, stayed up for us all night, which is really lovely of him. So let's give him a big round of applause. Yay, Jim. Thank you for being with us. And then I just wanted to just have a show of hands for who hasn't been on a Mind Medicine Australia webinar before. Just a show of hands if we could. That's great. Okay, quite a lot of you. So what we might do is we're just going to show a really short video. Ilan will just play very short video as an introduction to us. And firstly, though, I'd like to acknowledge all of the ancient owners of the lands on which we come from, the elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge the wisdom and light keepers, the people, the medicine men and women who've brought these medicines to us throughout the ages, from the beginning of human civilization to today, so that we can heal and we can raise our consciousness, and never have they been more important. So we acknowledge all of them as well. And now we're going to play, yes we do, thank you very much Shelley for your beautiful gestures. And now we're going to play a very short video. Then we'll give a very short introduction about the work we're doing and where we are in Australia, and then Scott will introduce Jim Fadiman.
Did you know that over 45% of Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime? That's nearly half of us.
Everything feels flat and grey. I feel ashamed.
Mental ill health devastates lives and families and costs Australians around $60 billion a year. Research and treatment expenses continue to rise, yet rates of mental illness indicate that we're losing the battle. New approaches are urgently needed to address this immense suffering and cost. Psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is currently being trialled worldwide and has demonstrated remarkable promise in treating depression, anxiety, addiction, and post-traumatic stress disorder, with new trials underway for treatment of dementia and anorexia. The treatment combines a short program of psychotherapy with just a few medicinal doses of psilocybin or MDMA. In the 1950s and 60s, psychedelic treatments had a major impact in psychiatry, and many considered it the next big thing in mental health treatment. But for political reasons, the Nixon administration criminalised the use of psychedelics and effectively stopped all research. That research has finally begun again. With proper clinical support, psychedelic treatments are safe and frequently lead to remission after only a short program, and even where current treatments have failed. Here at Mind Medicine Australia, we believe everyone should have access to the best treatments for mental illness. We will seek to establish best practice in regulated psychedelic-assisted treatment. Mind Medicine Australia is wholly focused on the clinical application of psychedelic medicines. We're preparing for change by developing therapist training, ethical guidelines, a centre of excellence in psychedelic medicine, educational material and events, and supporting clinical research. We're a small organisation doing big things, and we need your support. Please share this video and visit our website to support us and get involved.
Thank you, and we'll put the link to that video in the chat, and if you can share it on your social media and other platforms, be super grateful. We just want to have a little poll of, where people are from. So if you put in the chat where you're from, not all of you, but if you're from somewhere other than, somewhere unusual or different, or wherever you're from, we'd love you to put it down, and then I can let Jim know where, people are from all over the world. Geelong, Mackay, Central Coast, Minnesota, Sydney, lots of people from Sydney, Perth, Brisbane, Adelaide, Townsville, LA, Hobart, Gippsland, Bunbury, all over the place, the Gold Coast, etc. Thank you very much, everyone. We have a global community here. So this session is called All About Microdosing, New Findings and New Uses with Dr. Jim Fadiman from the USA. So we welcome Jim very much to this session. We'd also like to invite you to put your questions into the chat. The way that this session will evolve is, as I said, we'll do a short introduction to Mind Medicine Australia now. Scott will introduce Jim. I have a number of questions that have been posed to Jim, which I'll ask him, and he'll answer those. And then we'll have hopefully lots of time to answer some of your questions as well. So we're looking forward to your participation, and we'll start with our slides now. Next slide, thank you, Alana. And just a reminder that our focus is wholly clinical. We don't facilitate illegal use of psychedelics or plant medicines, and we are recording this webinar, and it will go onto our YouTube channel, and we really recommend you watch it again and share it. Of course, there's many people who will be watching it later who couldn't make this particular time. There's over 800 people registered for this webinar. Next session. And we have this major crisis in Australia, which all of you will be fully aware of who are in Australia. And of course, this is a global crisis as well. Pre-COVID, 1 in 5 Australian adults had a mental illness. 1 in 8 Australians were on antidepressants, including 1 in 4 older Australians over the age of 55. And 1 in 30 children were being prescribed antidepressants as young as 4 years old. It's estimated that 1 in 2 Australians will experience mental illness in their lifetime. But sadly, as a result of the COVID pandemic, 4 in 5 Australians are now reporting poorer mental health, and 34% of Australians said their mental health had declined in the pandemic. Next slide. Unfortunately, for veterans and first responders, the incidence of mental illness is far higher, with almost twice as many veterans having mental illness as the rest of the population. And 1 in 3 first responders suffer from high psychological distress, with 1 first responder committing suicide every 6 weeks. More veterans killing themselves than getting killed on the battlefields. This is absolutely a tragedy, and we must do something about this. There's also many other sectors in the community that also have a higher incidence of mental illness than the general population, including accountants, lawyers, farmers, and so on. Next slide, thank you. And this, of course, leads to a huge impact, immense suffering, not only for the individual, but of course for their families and carers. Leads to unemployment, homelessness, and sadly can lead to a person taking their own lives as well. And the total cost of mental illness and suicide to the Australian economy in the last year was approximately $220 billion. Just think how much money could be saved if these treatments became available. Next slide. The elephant in the room is the lack of innovation in treatments for mental illness for over 50 years. So our governments keep talking about providing new patient access gateways, about training more psychiatrists and psychologists, about providing more subsidies for mental health plans and so on. But the fact of it remains that if we can't get to the root cause of a person's suffering, we can't get them well and out of the system. They remain in the system, and of course the wait lists for clinicians are enormous, or unfortunately people may drop out of the system, and that can also lead to terrible outcomes. Next slide, thank you. So in the case of depression, only approximately 35% of sufferers experience remission from either antidepressants or psychotherapy. There's enormous relapse rates after treatment stops, and many of you will be fully aware of the significant side effects of antidepressants for many people. In the case of post-traumatic stress disorder, remission rates can be as low as 5% and certainly no higher than 10%. So we're not getting a lot of people well, and more of the same is not going to solve the problem that we have. Next slide. So we're a charity that was set up by myself and my husband, Peter Hunt. We're social entrepreneurs and philanthropists. We've set up 6 charities between us, and our goal is to expand the treatment options available to doctors and their patients through establishing safe and effective psychedelic-assisted treatments to cure a range of mental illnesses, as you saw on that video at the beginning. We're focused at the moment on psilocybin and MDMA, but we're also interested in medicines including ketamine, ibogaine, DMT, ayahuasca, and so on, and LSD. For us, success means that these therapies become an integral part of our mental health system, which means that if you go to your doctor, that they'll not only talk about antidepressants or other psychiatric medicines or psychotherapy, but they'll also talk about psychedelic-assisted therapies with full disclosure on the risks and benefits of all treatments that they're bringing up as options. We also hope that these medicines will continue to achieve the incredibly high remission rates that they're achieving in over 200 trials around the world. And these remission rates are between 60 to 80% across a range of trials after just 2 to 3 medicinal treatments with a short course of psychotherapy. And finally, as a charity, we're very passionate about making sure that these treatments are accessible and affordable to all Australians, no matter where they're based or their financial circumstances. Next slide, thank you. So we saw at the beginning some of the conditions that these medicines are being used for, including depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, addiction and PTSD and so on. But of course, we're also seeing these medicines being made available for a range of other conditions, including anorexia and eating disorders, end-of-life stress, Alzheimer's and early stage dementia, and a whole range of other physical ailments, including fibromyalgia and cluster headaches and so on. As I've mentioned, the remarkable thing about these treatments is they only require 2 to 3 medicinal sessions in combination with psychotherapy. And so this is not a lifetime sentence. Mental illness does not have to be a lifetime sentence. There is a way of getting cured and not just managing a condition. And both of these medicines are considered to be very safe in medically controlled environments and non-addictive, and the current trials draw this out. Both of these medicines have also been granted breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA in the US, and this is a very rare designation. It's only given to medicines that could be vastly superior to existing treatments. And it means that once the medicines go through the phase 3 trials, and if those phase 3 trials draw out the same sort of conclusions as the phase 2 and 1 trials, it means that those medicines will become prescribable immediately. And that is where MDMA-assisted therapy is currently at with the FDA. It's in part 2 of phase 3 trials, and I'll show you a little bit of research on that in a moment. Next slide, thank you, Alan. So the important thing to note about these treatments, and I'm sure Jim will talk about this further, is that set and setting is incredibly important. And set means mindset, so that you go in with the right intention and the right mindset. And setting, of course, means where you are, who you're with, and how your space is being held with safety and comfort and love and warmth, so that you can feel a sense of healing. Normally, what happens with the medicinal sessions is that you'll be screened by the relevant therapists to make sure you are a suitable candidate. The therapists will go through what will happen in the sessions with you and explain, how the medicine will potentially act so that you're prepared for the session. You can set the right intention and have the right mindset. And then the most important part of it all is the integration, so that you bring these incredible insights and learnings that you may experience with these medicines into your life, your work, your relationships. Many patients describe these treatments as one of the top 5 most meaningful experiences in their lives. Imagine saying that about a medicine. And that's because of the sense of oneness, of connection with self, others, the planet. This awesome sense of wonder of seeing nature and every human being in a completely different context after you've had these remarkable experiences. And these medicines create a real window where the brain is more flexible, and the therapist can work with the patient to integrate these experiences back into their lives to create lasting and sustainable change. Next slide, thank you. So what's going on in the brain? Well, Jim, would you like to talk a little bit to this slide?
No, you're doing wonderfully. I'm learning a lot.
I don't think so. Okay, well, I'm very close to introducing you, or Scotty is. So what's happening with these medicines is that they're altering communication between different brain networks. So they're said to bypass what's called the default mode network of our brain. The default mode network keeps us defaulting and stuck in often very rigid thought patterns, often created in early childhood. And you can see representations of fMRI scans on the right of this slide. And you can see the one on the right is someone with depression or trauma who is having those very ruminative, stuck and rigid thought loops. I'm not good enough, things are never going to work out, no one loves me, and so on. Whereas in the diagram on the left, and it's important to note that both diagrams have the same amount of dots and lines. It's just one is a really highly functioning brain and the other one is a bit stuck. And you can see with the ingestion of the psilocybin, you achieve this massive neurogenesis in the brain, this reconnection of neural pathways, reconnection between different hemispheres, increased neural plasticity, leading to this sense of connection and oneness that I mentioned. And really it is disconnection that really underpins most mental illnesses. And Johann Hari talks about that very well in his book, Lost Connections, that often what we're experiencing is this sense of separation, aloneness and isolation. And these medicines very effectively help us to reconnect. And that then helps us to break out of those repetitive styles of thinking, and we become agents for our own healing. So instead of having to take a daily pill or multiple medications, we actually start to work with our therapists and with ourselves to heal ourselves. And that is a really important part of the healing process. Next slide, thank you. So Mind Medicine Australia's commitment is to build the ecosystem in Australia so that we can actually ensure that as and when these medicines become available through legal avenues, that we have a system here that can really support the treatments. And so we do that through these educational events. We have an amazing free webinar series. For those of you that have been on this year, you've seen some of the extraordinary speakers, and we've got a final one coming up with Dick Schwartz shortly as well. And many of you will have come to the previous one, which was with Bessel van der Kolk. We also are planning potentially another major international medical summit later next year or early the next year. We have over 30 chapters around Australia that educate and build awareness and run local events, lobby state and federal politicians and so on. And Scott is our chapter manager amongst his many roles. So if you're not in one of our chapters and you'd like to join one of them, please let us know, reach out to Scott or reach out via our website. Or if you're in an area where we don't have a chapter and you really would love to start one, reach out to Scott as well. We also support novel research, and we've just announced a fund to support observational trials. We also have Asia Pacific's first ever professional development certificate in psychedelic assisted therapy course for health practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, GPs, paramedics, psychotherapists, counsellors, nurses, social workers, and so on. And David Nutt described it as one of the world's leading courses. It has a global faculty, including Jim, and many other of the world's leaders in this field. We also have some short online courses as well to help people get up to speed in this space. We also partner with a range of universities, and we're also looking at, of course, the legal and ethical frameworks for these medicines. We've submitted rescheduling applications, and we've just had an interim decision which has indicated that the TGAs and the government is again not rescheduling the medicines, but we have until the 24th of November for all of us to kick up a huge stink and demand that it is inhumane to further withhold these treatments from Australians who are suffering. So we encourage you to be the change you want to see in the world. We're also looking at the manufacturing and importing of these medicines into Australia, rollout strategies for clinics, harm reduction services, and so on. Next slide, thank you. Oh, we also unlocked the $15 million of funding that the federal government provided for trials in Australia, and that's kicked off a range of trials around Australia as well. So Tim Ferriss, who is the person who introduced me to these medicines and who's a great donor in this space, says he views the next 5 years as a golden window in which a small amount of money can affect millions of lives. And next slide, Alana, and we really encourage you to help us in any way that you can. Start conversations, share the information on our Learn page of our website, share this video, read all of our content, join our chapters, talk to your medical practitioners. And if you're a medical practitioner yourself, talk to other medical practitioners. And yes, someone's saying, can someone please put together a template with who to email so we can help kick up a stink? Yes, Scott is doing that at the moment, and he will reach out to you about that.
We'll have a lot of communications coming out over the next couple of days.
And we are going to kick up a huge stink. We also encourage you, like Peter and I are philanthropists, but we can't do this on our own, and we really need your support. So, you know, you can become a supporter, a small or large supporter, and, you know, even just for the price of 2 coffees a week, you know, you can help us in a significant way. So we encourage you to join us as a donor. We've got over 800 supporters at the moment, from small to large, but we have a huge mission, and it does cost a lot of money. Though Peter and I donate our time and we donate a lot of our money, the majority of our funds to this charity, we can't obviously do this without your support. It's also really important to talk to your local, state and federal members of parliament. And Scott also has templates for how you can do that and how you can approach them, so you can reach out to him about that. And we have lots more events coming up, so keep your eye on that. And of course, many of you will know that we've got Professor David Nutt coming to Australia in a couple of weeks' time. We're bringing him out, and he's doing events all over, and I'll show you a slide on that in one moment. Next slide, thank you. So this is our short 4-week online course, and there's more on that on our website. Next slide, thank you, Alan. And our certificate in psychedelic assisted therapies, and there's way more on that at the website down the bottom of that slide. And we're at the moment, we've got an enormous wait list for 2023, but please join it, because we'll do as many intakes as we can next year. Next slide, thank you. Join your chapter, next slide. We have lots of goodies. We have mushroom gift cards, and we have our first ever book of Australian healing stories featuring 53 Australians who've healed through these treatments, either legally or illegally, but they've healed. And we've got masks, bags and T-shirts. And next slide, thank you. So Professor Nutt will be here from the middle of November till the end of November in Byron Bay at the Byron Theatre, Canberra at ANU, Sydney at Paddington Town Hall, and then in Melbourne at Monash, University of Melbourne. And we have an amazing gala dinner with him on the 30th of November at the Australian Club in Melbourne, and we're really looking forward to having him with us. He'll also be meeting with politicians, he'll be meeting with the TGA and the media as well. And Jim, maybe you'd like to come to Australia sometime. We'd love to bring you, that's for sure. Have you been here before?
Oh yes, I've been a number of times, and I've talked in most of those venues.
Yeah. Oh, wonderful. Well, we'll have to look at bringing you out maybe next year, or shortly. Next slide, Ilan, please. So final webinars. So we've got Dick Schwartz on the 9th of November, and then we have all these David Nutt events for this year. And we'll be shortly releasing our 2023 global webinar series as well. Ilan is working on that. Next slide, thank you.
That's it.
That's it. So Scotty's now going to introduce Jim.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I feel that Jim doesn't require much of an introduction, but it does make me happy to give a brief one. He began his career as a researcher at Stanford, and if I'm not mistaken, I think it was LSD that he began with, but I'm sure he'll tell you more about that. After the lull in research began, he shifted his priorities and focused on teaching, training, amongst other things. And as a part of this, he co-founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, which is now known as Sophia University, and taught at it for a number of years. And then another great achievement of his is becoming an author, and he's published a number of works, one in particular that I'm sure many of you will know, which is the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. And if I may indulge myself very briefly, I'd like to take this opportunity to say a huge heartfelt thank you to you, Jim, for that work, because that was an incredibly important piece of writing for me and very fundamental in changing my views of these medicines and understanding the potential of them. So while I do have the opportunity from the bottom of my heart to yours, thank you for writing that and for the impact it's had on my life. And so with that, with no further ado, Dr. James Fadiman.
Thank you so much, Jim. So the way this, welcome.
Nice introduction. I just feel so welcome.
You are so welcome. We're delighted to have you. So again, if you put your questions into the chat, we're going to start off with a few questions that have already been posed for Jim. So Jim, would you like to just start off explaining what microdosing is? Because there's a lot of misunderstanding just about that, and also what is microdose coaching?
Sure. I mean, after that wonderful introduction, which gave me a quick course in how many different ways psychedelics are already affecting kind of mental health thinking, mental health practices, and eventually mental health regulations. But we're not at stage 3 yet. Microdosing has not yet acquired any of that. Microdosing is taking a tiny amount, a 10th to a 20th of what is called a recreational dose, and probably a 20th to a 40th of what's called a therapeutic dose of classic psychedelics, predominantly LSD, psilocybin-containing mushrooms, and a host of others. It is also not taken once or twice. It is taken intermittently over a few weeks to a few months. And the best definition of a microdose is it has no classic psychedelic effects, no incredible transformations of the way you see the world, no angelic choruses welcoming you home. And for those of you who understand a little bit about ayahuasca, you don't also have giant anacondas that eat you. So it is not an explosive, fantastic, amazing event. It is not one of the 5 most important events of your life. However, it seems to be remarkably capable of doing healing of both mental and physical conditions. And we'll look at perhaps why and perhaps what kind as we go along. So microdoses, again, are very small doses taken every few days over a period of time.
And do you know when the earliest microdosing in Australia started taking place?
Probably 30,000 years ago, maybe 20,000 years ago.
Wow.
Remember, in Australia, you know, we're very much Johnny-come-latelys to this continent. But if you actually check in with the Aborigines, they will talk about a particular substance, for example, a pituri, P-I-T-U-R-I, which you may or may not have heard of. But pituri is a substance which, if you put a lot of it in a pond, the fish will die, which makes them a lot easier to catch. Also, the fish who die are totally safe to eat. So it's been used by the Aborigines as a poison. However, the Aborigines also learned that in a microdose, it served to increase energy, to eliminate or lessen the need for food and water for long walkabouts. And it has been used then successfully to help Aborigines function in, as we know, a somewhat difficult environment for thousands of years. So that's the first use. The second use is among the settlers, I'm not sure whether you certainly don't call yourself colonists. And that's using psychedelics the way the rest of the kind of Europeanized world uses it, which is predominantly psilocybin-containing mushrooms and LSD, again, in very tiny doses, and not in the same way that has been used traditionally. What we've done in contemporary modern microdosing is develop the notion of a protocol, meaning a schedule, and also a very, very careful measuring of doses for specific effects. So that's a start.
Thank you. And there's questions on the chat, and it's a question we had already too, but what about mixing it with current medications? So what happens like if you're wanting to microdose, but you're on antidepressants, for example? Are there contraindications and so on?
Now, understand that almost everything I'm going to talk about and mention is based on individuals who have written our website or written to friends or written to coaches about their own personal experience. And one of the most common questions is, can I still take XX medication with this? So we developed a list on my unfortunately broken website at the moment called microdosingpsychedelics.com, but it had 180 items that people could microdose with. That includes almost all antidepressants, antipsychotics, Adderall, and the stimulants. Lots of, basically almost all medications were safe. We had a question about lithium carbonate. Some people said it was not a good idea. Some people said it was a good idea. So we say it's not a good idea. But fundamentally, we're dealing with psychedelics, as Professor Nutt will tell you, are among the safest pharmaceuticals available. Microdoses, being a 10th to a 40th of that, are even safer. So we have found very few substances that seem to have any strong interaction with microdoses at all.
That's wonderful. And there's a wonderful note here from Heath that's just come up on the chat, which says, I was on SSRIs for 14 years, began microdosing while on them, gradually cut back. I'm now off SSRIs for the first time in 14 years and have never felt happier. Congratulations, Heath.
Okay, now that brings up one of the uses, and it's a use which doesn't fit into the clinical model. But one of the problems that was described, you're going to remember that slide that said how the large percentage of people taking SSRIs for whom it's not effective? How do we know that? That's because they're still on SSRIs and getting negative or no effects. That's how we know about it.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to get off a SSRI and a number of other medications. Microdoses are used to help people taper off. Definitely one does not stop a medication and take microdosing. That is potentially very dangerous. But as this wonderful chat said, and I want a copy of what he said because it's wonderful, is not atypical. Is people are saying, I can finally have some help in tapering off a medication that no longer serves me. And this is a particular use of microdosing, and it doesn't fit the high dose model at all. So this is a specialized use of microdosing. And thank you so much for the question.
Thank
or for
you.
The example really wasn't a question, it was a testimonial.
Yeah, it's a lovely one. A question here too, is Amanita muscaria a genuine microdosing mushroom?
Yeah, Amanita muscaria is the Christmas mushroom. It's the very red one with the little white dots. And it's we get all of that terminology from where it's used in Finland. You might notice the clothing that Santa wears, why he's picked a color scheme of red and white. There's some fascinating video footage of reindeer pawing the snow. And as you see them with their little hooves, they're exposing an Amanita muscaria mushroom because they happen to love it. So Amanita muscaria has one small problem. A high dose is toxic in that it makes you so crazy that people will decide that they can run through doors which are closed. So
that's a problem.
A lot of reports from high doses are written from hospitals. The low dose, and this is really new, this we didn't know, low doses are effective as microdoses, but the Amanita muscaria must be cured a little bit. Other mushrooms can just be dried. There is a new book out called Microdosing with Amanita muscaria, a study of 3,000 people, enormous number of conditions, very interesting. And I recommend, if you're looking at Amanita muscaria because it may grow in your backyard, this could be a very useful book. This is really a discovery at the moment.
And just a question here too, Jim, from Inga, who says, is there a percentage of people who have no effect from microdosing?
I assume so. What happens, it's a little hard when you're doing this kind of survey work where people write you. People usually who have no effect don't write much. However, when you have a number of people who start and then you say they stopped and you ask them, they say, well, it didn't have any effect, or it felt negative in some way. And what we used to say when people had any kind of problem with microdosing is stop. Now, because there is microdose coaching and a lot more sophistication, we say before you stop, take half the dose. And if you're not having any effect, try raising the dose before you quit. And we found that general population without any information, maybe 20% of people will stop microdosing. People who are being coached, maybe 1 or 2%. So we're learning something about how to titrate perhaps the right dose for each of us. And it is definitely a personal level. It's not the problem when you go to your pharmacist and you want a medication, it comes in a dose, maybe 2, maybe even 3 different doses, but that's it. But if you think about it, imagine you want to eat ice cream. It doesn't come in 1 or 2 or 3 levels. It comes in however much you put in your bowl. And if you take too much, you don't finish. And if you haven't had enough, you can get more. It's called finding the right dose level for you at the right time. Microdosing fits that model.
Excellent. That's really excellent to hear. And how do you think that all these anecdotal reports of people's healing experiences through microdosing, how can we use those reports to lead to clinical research?
Well, if you really look at clinical research, it's anecdotal. Meaning, and I mean that in a very real sense, which is someone says to you, I've been depressed for 12 years. Okay.
Like
now,
Heath for 14 years or whatever.
So remember, depression has no measurement. Okay. There isn't, all the depression scales are based on what people say. I'm very depressed. I'm slightly depressed. I'm depressed when the moon is high. I'm depressed during the summer. You know, those are all people telling you something. Now, what happens in clinical research is you take people who said they're very depressed and you give them an appropriate, careful, therapeutically acceptable amount of high dose psilocybin or LSD. And then afterwards you say, will you take the depression scale again and tell us how you feel? Okay, that's hard science. What we've found, and we call it citizen science, which has a longer history than science, is we say to someone, just as that person who wrote in said, I was depressed for, I believe it was 14 years. Now, I believe that person. That seems like a sentence. The person said, I then microdosed and I am not depressed now. That's a second statement, not different than the clinical one. The difference is that we don't know who the person is and we haven't met them and we haven't any other necessary information, but that's what I call search. That says something's going on and it's worth looking at. So that eventually people will say the same thing in a clinical setting and it will get published in a peer-reviewed journal. And the people for whom peer-reviewed journals are a necessity, and that includes usually government bureaucracies, will have the information they need. But it's all based on, for most mental conditions, a lack of any measurement except what has been just mentioned as the word anecdote.
Thank you. There's a question here from JC who says, does microdosing cause or increase heart problems?
Oh, there's a little rumor out there that it is possible that if one took microdosing over an unknown amount of time, that it is possible that it could affect the heart valve because there is a totally different substance called ephedrine, has nothing to do with any psychedelic. It was with a diet help called fen-phen. People who took fen-phen daily in a dose approximately 1,000 times the amount of a microdose over a period of months, some of them developed serious heart problems and the drug was withdrawn. It's hard for me to make the connection between a totally different drug and a totally different dose and a totally different dose schedule. However, what is in common is that among the parts of the brain that were affected by fen-phen and are affected by psychedelics is a particular neuron named 528. So both of them are affected. And as you can see, I'm controlling myself and not saying that the evidence is very thin. Now, also, if we look at high dose psychedelics, which would be more reasonable to assume some kind of damage, in the United States, and I don't know the numbers for Australia, but in the United States, there's about 40 million people who've taken a high dose. And there are a lot of them, particularly from my friends in the 60s, who've taken a lot of doses, a whole lot of doses.
A lot of high doses.
A lot of high doses. And so far, and again, we only have about 40 years of data, we have no cases. So I'm not sure that, I think the heart is a little bit of what is called conspiracy theory, okay? Or a way of concern, of raising concerns for which there is no evidence. And also, it will never be tested. No one is going to say, well, all we need to do is take 100,000 people who are microdosing and follow them for 20 years and see if any come up with a rare heart condition over the percentage of people who would get it not microdosing. And we're never going to do that research. So it will exist out there as a kind of floating concern, which is what the question was. And I hope I've alleviated that concern, at least for the person who asked.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions here about SSRIs and SNRIs reducing the experience in macrodosing, which is definitely true that they do that. But is that also the case in microdosing? Like, do they numb out those receptors so that if you start taking microdoses at first, it may feel like you're not getting any?
It may, but again, one of the major uses that we find for microdosing is people getting off those medications.
Yeah, exactly.
So they seem to feel that there's if the effect is, and what happens is people say, whoa, I don't feel numb the way I am now feeling on antidepressants. Therefore, and then that's where you have to watch it. Therefore, maybe I don't need my antidepressant. The answer is no, 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 no. You don't need your antidepressant, but you can't stop it quickly or it will harm you.
Yeah, thank you. What about microdosing San Pedro? There's a question here about that as well.
San Pedro is a cactus. Major alkaloid in the cactus is mescaline. Mescaline is one of the classic psychedelics, along with LSD and psilocybin. It has basically the same effects as LSD, obviously a much higher, amount. In the United States, by the way, just the way regulations work, mescaline, as found in the cactus peyote, is illegal. It's what's called Schedule 1, no possible uses, etc., and high possibility of abuse. Mescaline in the San Pedro cactus is not covered by the law at all and is 100% legal. So the questioner is asking, basically, can one microdose perhaps with San Pedro? And the answer is, at least in the United States, it's perfectly legal to do so. And again, the question of dosing is a little harder with San Pedro, but if the person asking the question is generally knowledgeable and is willing to go on Google and find out, there's a lot of people who will talk about how it's used properly.
And we have a lot of San Pedro cacti growing in people's gardens. I know I've got some in my garden. So there's a question here about, can you speak about the neuroscience of what's happening when you're microdosing psilocybin?
Yeah. Up until very recently, it was very easy, which is there's no studies at all. But I have just, the timing is perfect. I have in my email this morning a report of a study which just was published in Nature by Harriet DeWitt and Murray Connor and a couple of others, which basically says if you give a microdose to individuals, and this is a double-blind placebo study, the reward system in the brain is stimulated by the microdose and is not, surprisingly, stimulated by the placebo. Now, I have to tell you, I haven't read the paper, so if you say what part of the brain is the reward center, I'm with you. I don't know. But I do know the researchers and I do know the research, and what they were looking at is there a shift in brainwave functioning similar to what you saw in the slide of the circle with a few lines and the circle with a lot of colored lines. Microdosing somewhere in between where there's a few more colored lines.
Thank you. That's wonderful. We've got actually Vince Polito is on this webinar. I'm sure you know Vince.
Hi, Vince.
Vince, would you like to comment at all on that question as well, on what's happening with the neuroscience
Well,
when
you
you're
know,
microdosing?
now, with Vince in the audience, who is the world leader in this area and is also doing his own research study at the moment on exactly that question.
Yeah, and he's Australian, right? So how cool.
Actually, no, Vince is in, I think, Macquarie University. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Macquarie in New South Wales. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you have one of the world experts in Australia who also has done a magnificent study, taking the best 40 studies or so on microdosing and analyzing them for their value and for their limitations.
Yeah. Hey Vince, did you want to make any comment about that the neuroscience question? If you do, just unmute your mic.
Unmute yourself and let's hear from you.
Yeah. And say hello to everyone so they at least can say hi and we can connect with you further, or they can connect with you further if you're there still, if your camera's on or something. Scotty, can you find Vince? Is he live?
I've just messaged him.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll bring him on in a second once we can reach him.
Okay.
There's a question here. What does your ideal future look like in regards to microdosing? Like, are people doing it beyond mental illness, for example, for general wellness, for creativity? Can it be used by everyone? What would be your absolute dream if you could, your wish list, I guess?
Well, I think what we know from indigenous people really all over the world and back perhaps as much as 9,000 years, that in a culture which accepts the possibility of psychedelics for high experiences and for practical uses, it should be available the way any other pharmaceutical would be. Now, if you go to your medicine cabinet, you will open it and you probably have something like aspirin, Advil, so forth. You have something that's relatively mild, that has a certain number of uses, and if you drank the whole bottle, you'd be in serious trouble. Okay? But we somehow don't think that people do that, so we don't restrict it. Portugal decided some years ago to make not only psychedelics legal, but all hard drugs, all the terrible bad drugs. And what they found was use of all of them went down. And because they were legal, when people got in trouble, they could get treatment. That seems like a very sane system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the idea that something that gives you better health is restricted by your government. That's it. That sentence makes no sense.
Absolutely.
Now, there's some historical reasons, and there was that wonderful slide that said Nixon, for reasons that were, by the way, totally political, had nothing to do with medicine, nothing to do with science. He had no idea what psychedelics did. All he knew is that people he hated used them. And he couldn't attack the people, but if he could attack what they were using, he could basically attack them. So we're coming out of a non-scientific, non-medical, non-psychiatric restriction on our own health, and it's coming very quickly, as you've noticed. I just got a copy of a magazine called The Californian. Now, this is a magazine put out for the alumni of the University of California at Berkeley. The purpose of the magazine is to keep graduates interested in the university, so they might want to donate to the university because there's a lot of opportunities. When I read through the magazine, the cover of the magazine basically, psychedelics are back without tie-dye. Okay. And there's about a 5-page story. And what I was noticing, the editor of the issue starts his own little commentary by discussing his own ayahuasca experience some years ago in Ecuador. The culture has shifted from repression and fear and a staggering amount of ignorance to let's find out what's going on. Let's use these safely and correctly. And we should allow our elected officials the same level of knowledge that the rest of us are experiencing.
Absolutely. There's an interesting question here. Will microdosing psilocybin show in workplace urine-based drug tests?
I actually didn't understand the question. Say it
Will,
again.
well, if you've had a microdose of psilocybin, will it show in like if you've got to do a workplace urine drug test?
Is it showing your, yeah, does it show in your, if you're peeing for a job? Basically, almost none of the tests test for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what we know is at least with psilocybin and LSD, where we have some measurement, most of it's gone within about 4 to 6 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Now, remember, LSD, you're taking millionths of a gram, so there isn't much even there to measure. So at the moment, the tests don't measure it. So I can't really have a statement how to, I mean, there are all kinds of websites that say what you can do to get the marijuana out of your system faster so you can get the job. There are no such websites so far about psychedelics.
A question here. Can you alternate between microdosing and sort of medical, clinical level
Macrodosing, high doses. Can you microdose and then macrodose and then microdose? And the answer is, according to the research or the records kept by the Microdosing Institute in the Netherlands, where psilocybin truffles, which is a part of the mushroom, are legal. So they have about 5,000 cases. And what they say, many people basically microdose for certain reasons. And when they feel it's appropriate to have a high dose, they use that. And they tend to stop microdosing before the high dose, kind of to clean out the system. And that seems very sensible. Keep in mind that these really have very different profiles of use, so that you're not taking it for the same reason. Again, remember I started by saying high doses give you, extraordinary breakthrough experiences. Microdoses don't. They only restore the equilibrium in the body where there is an imbalance. And let me give you a non-mental condition to think about. Migraine headaches. Migraine headaches have a number of causes, and the mechanism is unclear, and there are some medications that help. But people with chronic migraines don't get better from the medications. They just hurt less during migraines. We have a lot of records of people who microdose for migraines, and what they've said is, I still get migraines, but very seldom. That's a different mechanism. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any particular theory or physiological understanding. Maybe Vince does, but I certainly don't.
Is Vince there, by the way? Is Vince?
We haven't heard from him.
Okay, maybe give him a call on his mobile, Scotty. Would you want to give him a quick buzz, Scotty?
Sure, we can see if he's there and if he'd like to jump on. Maybe he's at home in his PJs and just wants to sit and
watch. That's fine.
Maybe.
Actually, if you can get Vince to do one of these webinars, you're going to have an exciting time.
Yeah, we definitely will do that for next year, Scotty. Could you invite him for next year to do one? Maybe a dialogue with Jim and Vince next year could be wonderful too.
Sure, that'd be fun.
Yeah. Next question here is the circulating idea of the stoned ape hypothesis suggests our ancestors' brains began growing at an extraordinary rate due to the consumption of psilocybin, making us more efficient hunter-gatherers. Do you believe this theory holds any merit, given what we know about the effects of microdosing and the developed abilities of our ancestors, or is it merely an interesting concept and nothing further?
Well, I'm not very good with theories, because there's another term for them, which is speculation or good guesses or interesting stories. I love that story. Okay. Now, there are other theories of why the human brain increased over a certain very small amount of time evolutionarily. One is the creation of fire, which led to cooking, which led to cooked meat, protein, which allowed people to eat a huge amount more protein. So they had more energy. The brain, remember, uses a huge percentage of the body's total energy every day. That's another possible causative factor. I love the idea that mushrooms are a causative factor as well. There's another which says the increase in complexity of how you function in a social group versus a non-social group is also something that might increase brain capacity. And primates have complicated personal social systems. They have hierarchies, they have kind of mating over time, they have fights, they have divorces, they have cheating, they have a lot of kind of very contemporary human conditions. And that's another possibility of how we move from having smaller brains to having larger brains.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Terence McKenna is one of the more wonderful storytellers about psychedelics in general, and there's no evidence for or against his hypothesis, and it has a certain common sense fun to it.
Okay, thank you. And what about people with low blood pressure? Can they microdose, or those with high blood pressure as well, I guess would be the question.
Well, again, what we have actually, it's an interesting question. We don't have people who said, I have high blood pressure and I'm microdosing and there's no problem. We only have people who said, have high blood pressure and medication and it's no problem. Mm-hmm. So we actually have very little experience with people just saying, I have this physical condition. Now, what we do have, and let me give you just one from kind of a far edge. Okay, we have people recovering from stroke with microdosing. Now, if you've had a stroke or a traumatic brain injury, we also have those cases. After a while, after a year or two, the rehabilitation world says that's all we can do. And our first kind of closely observed stroke patient had a major stroke 7 years earlier. According to his wife, in the ER, they debated whether they should try and bring him back, try to save his life. It was that serious. But after 7 years and a lot of alternative therapies, this was Northern California, he was functional. He could, but he had been a musician, guitar musician, and he no longer traveled, and he no longer played. And he functioned, but not terribly well. Now, he started microdosing and he started to function better. And his physician said he was functioning better. His friends said he was functioning better. His wife indicated he was drinking less. He could walk up the stairs more easily. He was more interested. He was more cognizant. And he said to her, I'd like to visit some friends in Mexico. Now, he hadn't gone anywhere for years. And she said, that's wonderful. I'm busy. In a couple of weeks, I can free up some time and I'd love to do that. He said, well, I want to go sooner than that. And so I got a call from her and she said he wants to go and he has tickets. Should he microdose while he's traveling? And I said, if it was helping him, I would keep it going. So he goes to Mexico and they're in touch with each other. And at one point he says, I'm having a good time with friends. She says, that's wonderful. And then he says, I want you to know I'm no longer using a cane. Okay.
Wow.
So that's the kind of thing in citizen science that gets your attention and says, maybe we should do some research in some of these more physical concerns, not just mental.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's fascinating. And just on that point too, like there's a lot of questions around early stage cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, and so on with microdosing. Yep. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I can. The story that comes to mind, and this is the father of a rather famous American musician. And what he said is he visited his father, who was living, I think, with a sister or with other relatives. The father basically hadn't spoken in weeks. He would sit on the couch. He was not unhappy. He was there, but not much. And the son felt that he might respond to music. So he microdosed his father and he started playing from their record collection or from their CD collection or whatever we use these days, jazz standards that his father would know. And after a while, his father was paying attention. And then his father was singing along with the vocal. And after a while, he was also, according to his son, singing rather complex vocals on his own. And this went on for 6 hours. Now, he hadn't paid close attention to anything for more than a couple of minutes for some time. And the rest of the family was like in happy shock. So that's one story. And there's some others, but that's a nice model of the possibility that even in dementia or in Alzheimer's, there's a lot of you left. And it may be able to be contacted. Again, we don't know. Now he did not retain this capacity. This was opening, not necessarily healing, but it was certainly a wonderful moment for everyone in that family.
It's amazing. And do you think that there's the potential, that, we all know that schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorders and so on are screened out at the moment from the clinical trials. Do you believe, or do you have evidence that microdosing can help those sorts of conditions?
Yeah. I mean, again, only from people who have done it successfully, without getting silly about it. See, the thing about regular science is you don't really want to have very disturbed people in your study, because what if it doesn't work, or what if it doesn't help them? You get not only blamed, but you get serious kind of moral repercussions. But in citizen science, where people do whatever they choose to do, and then tell you about it, you learn things that you could never do in conventional medicine correctly. It'd be unethical. So the particular study that comes to mind, this is a woman who was part of a group running a group in Vancouver, in the part of Vancouver, which is a horrible drug-infested neighborhood. Okay. And they were giving microdoses to people, and they were not keeping records. They were saying, we're not a clinical study. We're just here to help you if you'd like it. And at least one woman who had been schizophrenic for some years responded beautifully. And when I asked not the researcher, but this wonderful person who had been helping, she said, I became friends with her, and I was friends with her for a number of years until she died. But this came up because there is someone in Canada doing a paper on schizophrenia and psychedelics, and looking for these cases. So this was a microdose case, and the name of the group, or the way they called themselves, they were Microdose Mondays. Okay, so they were this little group giving away psychedelics in Vancouver to people who had all kinds of problems. Now, I don't know anything about anything more than I've told you, but that's a possible answer to the question. In terms of bipolar, when there's no clinical evidence because people who run in clinical studies don't want to try, then you do what we all do these days. You go to Facebook or you go to Google. In this case, Facebook has some sites for bipolar people who want to talk to each other. And I got on one of those sites and I talked to the moderator. And I said, can I ask your site, does any of them have a psychedelic experience? Because none of the research ever will have them in their studies, particularly bipolar people. Okay. So the answer was, sure, a lot of us have tried psychedelics, and the general rule of thumb from the bipolar community to themselves is never take psychedelics during your manic phase. It's very nice to take psychedelics during your depressed phase. Now, was there much difference between high dose and microdose? I really didn't get that information.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Michael Winkelmann, the anthropologist, and Professor Attila Szabo from Denmark, were both on our advisory panel like you are. They're looking at doing a citizen science study on microdosing of psilocybin to treat early stage Alzheimer's, and I'd love to put you in touch with them because I think there could be some really interesting synergy. So we'll do that. And for those of you that are interested in that citizen science project, we can connect you with Michael Winkelman and Attila Szabo, and see how, you know, we can help them to do that citizen science project.
Yeah. Well, actually, I'd love to see that. Michael, I've written some chapters for books that Michael has put together.
Oh, good.
And these are remarkably kind of encyclopedic mind about all these things.
Yeah.
Now, but I will now make a similar request, or to all of you who are listening. If you are interested in participating in citizen science, the way citizen science works for me in the microdosing world is tell me, as we had that one gentleman earlier on talking about coming off of antidepressants, any of your own stories of what you have discovered in yourself. And you can either send them to you or my email, my personal email is jfadiman, that's one word, at Gmail. And that would be helpful. And we're particularly at the moment, a friend of mine running a small psychedelic company is working perhaps on setting up a study for PTSD and microdosing. We know that PTSD does the MDMA in a therapeutic setting has done wonders. We don't know much about microdosing for PTSD. We have a couple of cases that are quite remarkable. But if any of you or anyone you know has microdosed for PTSD, either successfully or unsuccessfully, very much, you can move the science forward. Because what happens when you discover something like the stroke person, what happens is when you talk to a stroke researcher, they said, well, I never thought of that. But I can see why it might work. And then they give you some theory, and then funding happens and science moves ahead. And then eventually we're allowed to cure ourselves.
Well, yeah, I mean, please copy us in when you send those notes to Jim, because we'd love to share them as well.
Send them to either of us, or we'll
share that. We'll share the data.
And I'm very excited that Michael is doing that study because, again, we have a number of stories, but we haven't done a study on Alzheimer's, and it seems sensible that it will have some effect.
Yeah, I agree. I'll send a note to you and connect you to Professor Attila as well after this call. There's a question here, and I'm going to answer this one from Tiana about how long do you think it will take for psychedelics to be decriminalised and legalised in Australia for personal use and therapeutic purposes? So firstly, I mean, we've just seen the ACT government decriminalise small amounts of psychedelics in the ACT, and I imagine that some other states will hopefully follow suit. Of course, we're working very hard on the rescheduling of these medicines so that they can be available as unregistered medicines as medicinal cannabis is. And if they're in Schedule 8, that will become much easier. And that's why we need to kick up the stink that we talked about before. So we're going to kick up a huge stink very shortly, and Scotty will be in touch with you about that. But, you know, we see this as a matter of hopefully we can get the SASB, the Special Access Scheme in Australia, working, I mean, effectively over the next few months. There's been over 30 SASB approvals federally, and unfortunately the states have been blocking access to those poor patients who were expecting to be treated, which is just really inhumane, because for most of these patients this is really their last hope. They've tried in many cases, you know, multiple antidepressants or antipsychotics, multiple other treatments, EMDR, shock therapy, and so on. And so it's very, very important that they get the opportunity to try these treatments without either going underground or having to travel overseas, which many people can't afford. But we do on our website have a list under our services section of our website of legal retreats around the world and trip sitters as well. So if you do have the resources, of course, we're happy to connect you to some really reliable retreats and trip sitters overseas in legal countries like, for example, the Netherlands or Costa Rica or Peru and so on. Scotty, if there's any other questions, I mean, there's hundreds of other questions, I know. You know, what would you like to see unravelled next in microdosing research, Jim? I mean, you've covered a lot of that already with the dementia, and do you think ADHD is also a candidate here?
ADHD is now being researched in the Netherlands. And what I was told is the data looks good. And I said, can you give me any details? And they said, no, not until we publish. However, what we know in the real world with real people, when someone says the data looks good, is probably the data looks good. And of course, we have a lot of individuals who have, well, what we have is a lot of college students.
Yeah.
May or may not have learning difficulties, but what they say is, when I've microdosed, I'm able to pay better attention. I'm more focused. One woman said, I know I just need to look at the PowerPoint once, and then I can, take notes and be listening. I don't have to keep looking for it.
Yeah.
So, so we already have a lot of kind of citizen science information. We have a study going that looks positive, and it makes sense that microdosing, which increases creativity and mental flexibility, we see it. We have a whole lot of information for people who don't have a diagnosis.
Yeah.
We also have a lot of information on people with what's called high functioning autism, or
yes, I was going to ask you that question. Thank you.
We have a lot of information on that, and for that, what we found when we were doing our research, our being my colleague Sophia Korb, who was the really research genius of the group of two for a while. What we found is that most conditions show some improvement at a microdose level. People with high functioning autism would say, well, I took 10 micrograms, which you recommend, nothing. I took 20, which you say is too high, nothing. I took 40, a little bit. Around 50, I began to have the same sets of experiences that I read all over your site. So somebody, a wonderful, brilliant, just a lovely human being, wrote a book called Autism on Acid. And I recommend you, and an interesting part of it is if you go on Amazon, the book's there and you can buy the book. If you want it as an ebook or if you want it as an audio, it's free. It's from him. And he's already set up groups. He's actually doing research with the college in London. He is making the world aware of the benefits of both high and low dose for people with high functioning autism.
It's fascinating.
So again, that's how it works, which is, and his book, which I strongly recommend if any of you who are high functioning, meaning high functioning, mean you're very bright, you're super smart, you're probably in tech, and you have limited social, you don't have very good social skills because you don't actually pick up social cues the way other people do. Psychedelics seem to allow you to make that bridge. And as I know from all of my high functioning autism friends, nobody says, don't say you'd like to cure me of high functioning autism. It's a lot of special skills that you don't have. But I'd love to fill in the few skills that you, what are known as neurotypicals, have that I don't have as well. So that's really, in a sense, that's a done deal, which is we know enough. We haven't, science hasn't caught up with it, but the world of people who are interested and it's important to them, that's the answer.
Thank you. And also chronic fatigue, I imagine, there's a question here about that. I imagine that also is a really good candidate for microdosing.
Chronic fatigue syndrome is the technical term, CFS. And I recently got a wonderful letter from someone in another country, he'd rather not be mentioned. He's an executive in an international company whose name we all know. And he indicates that after some years of chronic fatigue syndrome and moderately debilitated, that microdosing has turned it around. And I wrote him and said, can I write you and basically give you the list of symptoms that is associated? And can you basically give me, which symptoms you had and so forth and so on? And he wrote back and he said, be happy to. I happen to be trying to finish a book proposal and I have neglected him. But we do have at least one very clear case. And what he said is, the reason I'm writing you is so other CFS patients can learn something that benefited me. And this is the core of citizen science, which is people do not write in to be admired. They never write in for credit because I take away their names and emails immediately, and I can't find them either. But they are, and we've said this on our website, the reason you write in your information is to help other people who have the same question. And that's the core of citizen science, is it's a cooperative, compassionate way of sharing information that eventually conventional science will be able to work with.
Thank you. No, that's a great answer. And what about people in a coma? Has it been tested with anyone in a coma before that you know of?
No. And in a sense, the other question is people, and it's the dementia question as well, is if someone says to me, can I give it to my uncle who has dementia? And I say, I'm personally not going to say to you, give it to someone who cannot make a decision whether it's okay. But I don't have also an uncle with dementia. I don't have to make that decision. Again, coma, we don't know enough about coma. There's lots of reasons for it. The chances of someone in a remember, you don't usually get a coma and you're at home and everybody is hanging out. You're in a hospital setting. And if you say to the hospital, would you mind if I give an unscheduled drug to this person in a coma? The answer is yes, I would mind very much. And I think they're correct in saying, if I don't know what you're doing, but I do know that what you're suggesting is at the least illegal, probably the answer is no. So we don't really have information.
Correct. Another wonderful testimonial here, Chris, from Chris, who says, my brother-in-law had a stroke, struggled to rehab for years. Since microdosing, he can walk up to 8 kilometers a day and does so regularly.
Oh, I mean, that's so wonderful. Okay. That's every once in a while, someone gives me something like that and I write them back and I say, this is what keeps us going. What keeps us going in the citizen science side is these kinds of extraordinary healings.
Yeah.
Because the nice thing is, see, let me step back. There's a whole lot of sciences where one case totally revises the theory. Now, psychological medicine never says one case is enough because psychological medicine is kind of sloppy and you don't know what you're talking about. Meaning, well, you can't measure depression, you can't measure all kinds of mental illnesses. So, except by asking people. So, but if you're in botany and you find one orchid, that's purple with blue stripes, that's it. You've done it. Everyone says that species exists. So what Chris just shared exists.
Yeah.
We don't know if everybody with a stroke would do better. Of course we don't. And the answer is no, that wouldn't be true. But the question is it worth checking? Got way more likely because of what Chris just said.
Absolutely. And there's a question also about Parkinson's. I imagine there could be some good outcomes with Parkinson's.
Yeah. Well, the years and years ago when I was just trying to figure things out, a man with Parkinson's, and the nice thing is he'd written quite a few books before he had Parkinson's, so he was both, he was a good observer and a good writer. He did a month-long study on himself. And what we got at the end of the month, and I learned a lot about Parkinson's, is he said, my Parkinson's symptoms have not changed much, if at all. But my social feeling of how I live my life has improved enormously. I am now willing to go out. I'm willing to be with people. I have gone to Parkinson's event. I've gone to Parkinson's dances. I have recovered from the depression that I had because I had Parkinson's.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you for that. Look, everyone, there's a lot of questions about dose amounts and dosing and so on, and Jim's book and resources cover all of that. So we're not going to cover that in this webinar, but Jim, what's the best place for all those questions for people wanting to know how to dose, how often to dose, all of that sort of stuff? Best resource is your website and your book, yeah?
Oh, but my website at the moment has crashed. So
oh, sorry, yes, of course.
At this moment, the Netherlands, the Microdosing Institute in the Netherlands is probably the best resource for now.
Mhm.
I'm at the moment, when I said I was working on something intensively, a book proposal, it's a book proposal called All About Microdosing.
Awesome.
So if you can hold your breath for maybe a year, year and a quarter, you can just read it.
And maybe you can come and launch your book in Australia and we'll help you sell lots of copies.
Well, I would be very happy. And also I will be rebuilding the website and using the very, very sophisticated coaching methods and coaching ideas from the Netherlands Institute and also from another group in the United States called Flow State Micro, which has taken on a lot of very, very hard cases like traumatic brain injury. So there are coaches, and we haven't really talked about it, but there's a whole, as my favorite coach said, coaching is beginning to spread like wildfire, which is, it's a way of helping people with microdosing, which is much less intense than being a guide for a full trip.
Yeah.
It is, remember, coaching, if you're being tracked, if you have a track coach, he doesn't run next to you. He just says, when you were doing that 10-mile run, I noticed you were raising one heel more than the other. Let's work on that.
It's like life coaching, really, also. It's sort of similar to that.
So there are coaches, and I'm sure by now there are coaches in Australia. And the coaching world is the next kind of emerging world in microdosing, just as integration therapists are the emerging world in high doses.
Absolutely. Sort of like you need your own Jim Fadiman Academy, like the Stan Groff Academy, to train all those millions of coaches who want to be microdose coaches around the world. There's a question here about, there's been a few questions on this. So I'm just going to round up the questions into one, which is, what's your position on stacking lion's mane and some of those other medicinal, legal mushrooms and the Paul Stamets stack sort of versus your own protocol?
The term, since Paul Stamets invented it, is called stacking. Stacking meaning putting things in a little pile. Okay. And if one takes a microdose in a capsule, there's a lot of room in the capsule when you put in the psilocybin. You can put in lion's mane mushroom, which is a cognitive enhancer and neurogenesis, meaning it grows new brain cells. And Paul Stamets has suggested you add a little bit of niacin, which dilates the blood vessels and allows a better distribution of the substance. Notice, not to the brain, but to the brain body. Okay. The idea that only psychedelics affect the brain is kind of silly. That's kind of like saying alcohol only affects the brain. Any of you who vomited having had too much alcohol know there are other parts of the system which get affected. So stacking is things that improve the functioning of the microdose itself. And there is some recent data published in Science Reports, a sample of 9,000 people over a couple of months. And the people who had psilocybin and niacin and lion's mane did a little better in some of the measurements than other people. So it looks like, not surprisingly, that your system reacts well when it is also when the psilocybin is being supported by other, in this case, medicinal mushrooms. There's also some recent and not published work of using certain herbs with a microdose, and that also has early reports are very favorable. And that's a whole nother use that is just not, it's not published yet anywhere.
And do you still macro and microdose yourself? I know that a lot of the presenters on our webinar series do still use the medicines, but do you find you need to or want to or don't need to, or you're so enlightened that and happy that you don't have to?
As fascinating as I know I am, my own personal habits are really not very helpful. I'm way off of the charts in terms of age. I don't have, I don't have any mental diagnoses that I can get better from. Have I microdosed? Meaning, the other question is, are you a eunuch writing about sexual behavior? And the answer is no.
That's fantastic. Another question here. if you were to introduce psychedelics to the Western world for the first time again, is there anything you would have done differently compared to how it was introduced in the 60s and 70s?
Oh my. Yeah. If we could fight World War I all over again, what would we do? Okay. Yeah. Sure. It's really the question that I've been asked before. If you were the drug czar of America, how would you do things? And the answer is I would not do it very well because I'm not very good at that. So the answer is, in the 60s, there was a general feeling that people could be trusted with their own consciousness. And that if they got in trouble, they could be trusted to ask for help. That's not a bad model. And that trust has eroded. There was also an optimism in the 60s that if you saw things clearly, you would begin to clear away long-standing problems, such as inequality and racism, and it had some effects. It's not generally talked about, but the ecology movement and the women's movement and the social justice movement all appeared in the 60s, were fueled by people who were using psychedelics.
Yeah.
So the answer is, if I were introducing psychedelics to the Western world, I would be probably too careful. And I mean, let me go back. When things were happening at Harvard with Leary and Alpert, who were using it somewhat casually, there were 2 points of view. There was Aldous Huxley, who said we should limit it to the kind of intellectual, social, artistic, philosophical elites first. And that's how it should spread. And then Tim Leary was more of the, well, what if we just put it in the drinking water and let it all happen? That's the range. And as someone else said, I was interested in using it for healing. Tim was interested in using it for revolution. That's a large span of possibilities. And the answer is neither one worked out quite right.
Yeah.
And if I had the right to do it all over again, I would make different mistakes, I hope, but probably equally glaring ones.
Yeah. Well, we all have to make mistakes to learn, and and that's just part of the process. There's a question here too. Have there been any horror stories at all associated with microdosing?
I'm sorry, I didn't really get the
Any
question.
sort of horror stories associated with microdosing at all that you know of?
Horror stories?
Yeah.
Oh, you mean people who microdosed and then went and murdered their children, that kind of story?
I guess.
Not yet.
Good.
I mean, let me give you an example. Here's what the definition of microdosing in a kind of operational sense. You have microdosed, you have gone to work, you have made some cold calls you hadn't wanted to make. You are nicer to someone in your office who doesn't deserve being nice to. You have made a connection at a sales meeting that people thought was pretty smart. After work, you went to the gym and you did 1 or 2 extra sets of reps. You went home and you were particularly enjoying your children. And at the end of the day, you said, oh yeah, I forgot I took a microdose. Okay. That's what microdose looks like. And there's another really wonderful called A Really Good Day by Ayelet Waldman.
Yeah.
This is a middle-aged woman in Berkeley, an attorney, and later on in life, a novelist who had taken, it's a fascinating thing, she'd taken about 40 different medications over the years, and everything hadn't eventually they all stopped working. And she microdosed for a month, and that's what she talked about, was what she was having was really good days. And for her, who started suicidal, that was fantastic. So it doesn't make your life a big deal, but it makes your life work better. And that in itself is a remarkable, it's pretty much when people say, well, how can I make my life work better? And the answer is, eat better, do exercise, get enough sleep, and have relationships. Now, it turns out that people who microdose for something else usually report improvements in all the areas I just mentioned. They literally say, oh my God, I'm eating healthier food and I like it. Oh, I'm meditating more. Oh, I have lowered my consumption of alcohol, of marijuana, and of coffee. Why have they done that? Why do you take those? You take those for a shift in consciousness. If your consciousness is feeling pretty good, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about normalizing people's behaviors so that they function from healthy center.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exciting, but well, it is exciting in a different way. Remember when you were ill with something, a cold, a flu, an injury, and you started feeling better. And you thought, oh my God, feeling better is the most fantastic feeling. But literally not much is going on. You're just feeling back to what your normal body would like to feel like. And that's what looks like microdosing does.
Thank you, Jim. Look, I just want to say on behalf of everybody, there's some wonderful comments coming through the chat now, and I know that we're going to share the chat with you, Jim, and you might come back with some more answers. And we will send a thank you note out with some links and all sorts of information in the next 24 hours to all of the participants in this webinar. And we do want to say, our webinars are free of charge, but if you've got a lot out of today, please do donate and support us. Scott will put a donate link in the chat now, and it's on our website. And if you enjoyed this webinar, please bring back 3 or 4 others to the next webinar that we have. And next year we will definitely invite Jim and Vince to do a webinar together as well. And Jim, we're just really grateful to you. You're such a legend, and you're so humble, and you're so wise, and we just are very grateful for your support. We're grateful that you're on our advisory panel for Mind Medicine Australia, and we just want to reach out and say a big clap to you from all of us.
I've done a number of things with the various training groups, and what I've seen over the years, by the way, is the training groups, and I do this kind of question and answer system because otherwise I don't know what you want to know. And what I've found is in the training groups, the questions have gotten much more tight and clear and sophisticated, which says that the training is both getting better and the quality of education that people bring to the training has improved. So one of the reasons that it's a pleasure to work with Australia is I'm so impressed and happy with how you're doing it. And if the United States goes crazy, which, as you know, is one of our possibilities, if someone has a small property in Tasmania, I'm still open.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Blessings to you. Have a lovely evening. And for all of you in Australia, if you can come and see Professor David Nutt, I mean, he's an absolute legend also, a brilliant man, a very humorous and wonderfully entertaining speaker who makes science really understandable for us all. And I really encourage you to attend those events, and especially our dinner in Melbourne if you're based in Victoria, to come and sit with David at that dinner, which will hopefully also help us to raise some really important funds that we need to achieve our mission.
If you can, I want to just add the same thing. David is really wonderful. He was the drug czar of England until he wrote something that was true, and then he got fired for it. Which is in the psychedelic world, being fired for being right and being helpful is a kind of badge of honor, and he has several. And he is a charming human being. He and I have had some very, very nice podcasts and personal talks. And I strongly recommend, if you have the chance to be with him, you'll feel very good that you did.
You will. Thank you, Jim. Look, you're an absolute gem, and we look forward to working with you further on our CPAC course and some webinars next year. We'll reach out very shortly. And we'll also send you some of these incredible comments that are coming on the chat so that you can see what people...
I'm very excited and happy, and thank you all for being not only interested in citizen science, but how many of you have become citizen scientists tonight, and I hope you do more of it. Okay.
Thank you. And Caroline says she has a place for you in Tasmania.
Oh, terrific. All right.
All right. Well, thank you all for your support of Mind Medicine Australia. Thank you all for being part of this community. It really matters, and we can be the change, and we can insist that we gain access to these medicines that can help us all not only to heal but to become more creative and more conscious. So thank you, all of you. Blessings.
Thank you.